Good afternoon, everyone. So Guy's asked me to give you some food for thought on the EU referendum from the CBI's perspective as sort of the voice of business, so a much broader business perspective than the businesses that you've heard from already today. So hopefully that will be interesting for you. But before going any further, I thought it's worth, not everyone in the room might be familiar with the CBI, so I'll just briefly outline who the CBI is and who we represent. The CBI is the largest business representative body in the UK. We speak for around 190,000 businesses of all shapes and sizes. We do that both through our confederation of around 140 trade associations, of which we're proud that the UK Chamber of Shipping is one, but also directly through corporate members as well. So we like to think that when the CBI speaks out on an issue of substance to do with the business community, that we do so very much with the weight of the majority of the British business community behind us. And there's very much no bigger issue facing the British business community over the next 18 months or so than the EU referendum that we have coming up, although we don't know exactly when it will be yet. I'm sure other speakers today will, and possibly in the panel to come as well, will give you plenty of sort of expert commentary on when the referendum might be and various other issues surrounding it. We've been very careful at the CBI to make sure that we stay very much within our business remit. So we haven't commented on questions of process around the referendum. We never commented, for example, on whether there should have been a referendum at all in the first place. We'd say that's very much in the gift of our politicians. So while I don't think it's in businesses' remit to have a view on the process, I very much do think it's in businesses' remit to have a view on the substance of the question being asked. So on that note, I might take you back to January 2013, when the Prime Minister's Bloomberg speech confirmed that there'd be the first serious chance in decades that the UK might actually be leaving the EU at some point in the near future. Given the fundamental importance of this question for our future as a country, at the CBI we undertook what is the biggest piece of work that we've done for decades. And the CBI, we're not a pro-European campaign. We're not we genuinely are there to represent the interests of our members, and therefore we started with an open mind as to what would be in the best interest for the country's future. We had a team from McKinsey working with us on economic data, and we consulted our members far and wide. So we spoke to all of our regional councils and our trade association council, which is the CBI's policy-making governance structure. We held 5 roundtables around the country with CEOs. We consulted our members operating in Brussels, Washington, Beijing and Delhi. And we also did a representative survey of our entire membership. The outcome was a big report called Our Global Future, which we published at our annual conference in November 2013, which we think is the most comprehensive study out there on how best to secure the UK's future economic prosperity. To summarise what is quite a long document, I'll probably talk about 2 main conclusions that it has. Firstly, the first conclusion is that while there are some costs of EU membership for business, and we've heard of some of those already today, like a lack of control over employment rules and the UK not always necessarily getting our way, we think that overall the benefits of membership far outweigh these costs. And interestingly, in the survey that we did of our members, 8 out of 10 CBI members, including 77% of small businesses, said that they would vote to remain in the EU if there was a referendum held tomorrow. But secondly, and just as importantly, our members were clear that the EU is not perfect and it must do a lot more to reform to boost jobs and growth across the EU, which would obviously be beneficial for the UK as well. So I guess in a nutshell, you could describe our position as in with reform, very clearly in, but also equally sure that the EU must change and do more to support businesses to create jobs and growth. Let me go into both of these in a little more detail. In terms of the benefits that members identified, there are 5 main benefits. The first one being that, quite a simple one, being in the EU means more customers for businesses to sell to. So being in a single market of 500 million people means that there are lots of additional customers for businesses in the UK to sell their goods and services to as if they were in the UK. Secondly, linked to that, and this is something there's been quite a bit of debate on already, and one of the benefits of going forth is that I can comment on what previous speakers have said already. But secondly, one of the other big benefits our members identified was that a common market does need common rules, and our members felt that common EU rules do make it much easier to do business across the EU. Yes, the EU doesn't all get doesn't always get it right, and I'll come on to that shortly. But the ability to have those common standards is very valuable for businesses, and the sort of things our members would tell us, that being able to sell across the EU with one set of rules rather than 28 sets just makes it much easier for them to do business. Thirdly, we found that being in the EU allows the UK to attract in a lot more international investment to the UK economy. So a number of companies will set up in the UK as a gateway to accessing the EU market, and having the platform then to influence the EU's rules as well from within the UK. Fourthly, and this is a slightly controversial topic, but for businesses, accessing the skills needed to grow is very important. Through free movement in the EU, UK businesses benefit from being able to hire talented employees from across Europe, and companies working in the UK can move resources around the EU with relative ease. And then finally, this is another one that's been touched on quite a lot so far today. We think that being in the EU is very beneficial for the UK economy in terms of trade. So our members would take issue with perhaps what Ruth and others were saying, and feel that actually the UK gets a better deal by going through the EU in terms of its trade deals, because we have the weight of a single market of 500 million people behind us, rather than negotiating on our own the important and powerful economy. So we're still having 500 million people behind us when doing those negotiations gives us a better deal. And just picking up on the Iceland deal for a second that we've talked about, the Iceland-China trade deal. Yes, it's true that Iceland has signed a trade deal with China, and yes, it's true we'd like the EU to sign a trade deal with China, but it's important to look at the terms of those trade deals. So, for example, I think with the Iceland trade deal, Iceland has to open up its market immediately to every sort of sector or portion of the Chinese economy, whereas China, I think in 5 or 7 years' time, whatever it happens to be, has to open up its economy to, I think, 2 products that Iceland produces. So you can see it's not necessarily such a balanced deal. We have to look at the terms of these deals as well as just the fact that they exist. But as I mentioned before, by no means do our members think the EU is perfect. Our members helped us identify 4 key areas where the EU must change to do a lot more to support businesses to grow. I think a lot of these will probably speak to the sort of things that David was talking about as well. The first one is that we want to see a much more open EU. And this is referring to the single market specifically. So the single market generally works very well for goods, but there are still far too many barriers to trading in services, and also for digital businesses. And given that the UK, we are probably the most successful services economy and digital economy in the EU, we have a lot to gain if the EU makes progress in these areas. The second is a more outward-looking EU. I said that we think that the EU's trade deals are beneficial for the UK, but of course that only holds true if the EU actually signs trade deals. So we need the EU to sign a lot more of them. And Ruth's completely right that the TTIP is absolutely vital, and we need to get that done and get that signed and sealed and delivered much faster than it's going at the moment. We also need to see a lot more progress with fast-growing markets, not just the established markets. The third area of reform we've termed a more competitive EU, and this one is referring specifically to regulation. And actually, the example of the sulphur directive that we heard is a classic example, and it's something I'm going to look into. It might be an example that at the CBI we can use a bit more. But actually, we need the EU to be reducing and simplifying rules. We need the EU rules to actually be a lot more enabling of businesses rather than stifling of businesses. And this is a really important area. And the final area we've touched on is what we've called a more balanced EU. And that's with this whole issue that as the Eurozone takes steps towards further integration, which actually I think as a country, it's in our interest for the EU, for the Eurozone to do that, because a strong and stable Eurozone, given the amount we trade with it, is in our interest. But at the same time, we need to make sure that there are safeguards there for countries that don't want to play don't want to play any part in the Eurozone, but do want to remain full members of the single market. That's just an issue that needs to be sorted. I know that's one of the important aspects of the Prime Minister's reform agenda. Over the past 18 months at the CBI, we've been working very hard to actually try and achieve these reforms, which we think will go a long way to help making the EU more competitive. As I mentioned before, the CBI is not a political campaign. We're not a think tank. We exist to represent our members. And unlike many organisations and individuals who often talk a good game on EU reform, we're actually out there trying to make it happen. I myself, for example, was in Stockholm just a couple of weeks ago, where we were meeting with our Swedish sister federation, SN, to see where Swedish and UK businesses can work together to push reforms forward. And over the past 18 months, we've been on 12 trips to meet our sister federations in various EU capitals to try and build a business consensus for reform across the EU. And what we're finding on our travels, actually, you might think is quite a positive surprise. The imperative for growth that there is around Europe at the moment seems to have opened up a bit of a window of opportunity whereby people are willing to consider things that previously might not have been on the table. So, for example, we went to Italy. We found that Italian business is pushing really hard to try and get the TTIP signed. Italy sees an export-led recovery as the key way of them moving their economy forward at the moment. The Spanish, for example, are big supporters of the digital single market, thinking that that's a really important way in which the EU will be able to compete with the fast-growing nations in Southeast Asia. And even our French counterparts are particularly strong on the need to reduce regulation, and they really want to work closely with us on that. So you can see there's quite a lot of movement there. And actually, this optimism is also reinforced for us when we look at progress made on our agenda in Brussels over just the past 6 months to a year, the sort of period over which the new Commission has been in operation. So, for example, and completely take David's point about the need for the Commission to not be siloed, but actually it seems like they're taking some, yes, small, but it seems like they're taking some steps in the right direction. So, for example, we've got a much more streamlined Commission now, with a number of sort of vice presidents acting as senior commissioners, putting together the work of some of the more junior commissioners underneath them. And actually, if you look at the number of new initiatives the Commission is planning to do this year, it's only 23, which I'm sure to some is 23 too many, but that's down from over 300 in 2010. So you can see there's quite a marked step change already. I mean, yes, we need to go further, but that is quite a marked change. I mean, other things I point to are things like a digital single market, a capital markets union, a new trade deal that the EU is signing with Vietnam. These are all small steps, but they are examples that perhaps the EU is starting to change the way it's thinking, given the imperative that we have for growth around Europe at the moment. I think getting these changes and keeping things moving won't only be good for businesses in their own right. They're also the sort of things which will help to persuade the public in the UK that continued EU membership is, on balance, in our economic interest. Look, as others have already and will continue to lay out, there isn't a universal business view on EU membership. The CBI represents a broad church, and we'd never claim that the views that I've expressed today is shared by every single one of our members. But it is true, though, that the majority of our members, businesses of all shapes and sizes across the UK, think it's in the UK's interest to remain in a reformed EU, and we're going to continue to represent that view as the referendum, whenever it might be, draws closer. Thank you very much.